Before we begin, I need to warn you that the stories you're about to hear are based on true events. The names have been changed to protect the identities of those involved, but the experiences, those are real. These are accounts from people who ventured into abandoned hospitals and encountered something they could never explain. Something that still haunts them to this day. If you're ready, let's begin with our first story. Story 1. The Night Shift at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital. My name is Marcus and I work as an urban explorer and photographer. I've been documenting abandoned buildings across the American Midwest for the past 7 years. I've seen a lot of creepy places, encountered squatters, dealt with unstable floors, and even had a few close calls with security. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital in rural Indiana. Riverside closed its doors in 1989 after a series of scandals involving patient mistreatment and several unexplained deaths. The state pulled its funding and the place was left to rot. By the time I heard about it in 2019, it had been abandoned for 30 years. The building itself was massive, a sprawling complex of interconnected wings that once housed over 400 patients at its peak. I convinced 2 friends to come with me. Jake, who handled video equipment, and Sarah, who was studying architecture and wanted to document the building's structure. We planned everything carefully. We'd go in at sunset, spend a few hours shooting, and leave before midnight. We checked the weather, brought proper gear, and even notified someone outside our group about our location just in case. The hospital sat at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, surrounded by dense woods. As we approached, the building looked like something out of a nightmare. It was a 4-story brick structure with broken windows that stared out like hollow eyes. Ivy had consumed entire sections of the exterior walls, and the main entrance was boarded up with rotting plywood. We found our way in through a side door that had been forced open, probably by other explorers or vandals. The smell hit us immediately, that distinct odor of decay, mold, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and wrong. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned psychiatric hospital. Long corridors with peeling paint, patient rooms with rusted bed frames still bolted to the floors, and common areas filled with overturned furniture and debris. Graffiti covered many of the walls, some of it just tags, but other pieces were more disturbing. Crude drawings of faces screaming, symbols I didn't recognize, and one phrase that appeared multiple times throughout the building: "They're still here." For the first hour, everything was routine. We moved through the ground floor, taking photos and video. Sarah was sketching architectural details, fascinated by the building's design. Jake was getting great footage. I was in my element, capturing the decay and atmosphere through my lens. We decided to head upstairs around 8:30. The stairwell was treacherous, with missing steps and a handrail that had mostly rusted away. We took our time, testing each step before putting our full weight on it. The second floor was dedicated to administrative offices and staff areas. File cabinets lay tipped over, their contents scattered across the floor. Old medical records, yellowed and water-damaged, were everywhere. I picked one up and immediately wished I hadn't. It detailed the treatment of a patient named William Hendricks, who had been subjected to electroshock therapy multiple times per week. The notes were clinical and cold, describing his deterioration in mechanical terms. That's when we heard it. A sound coming from somewhere deeper in the building. It was rhythmic, metallic, like something being dragged across the floor. We all froze. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered. We listened. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was definitely metal on concrete, scraping slowly and deliberately. It would drag for a few seconds, then stop, then drag again. "Probably just the building settling," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. "These old places make all kinds of noises." We continued exploring, but the atmosphere had changed. We all felt it. That sensation of being watched, of not being alone. I've felt this before in other abandoned places, but this was different. This was intense, oppressive. We reached the 3rd floor around 9:15. This level had been the acute care ward, where the most severely ill patients were housed. The rooms here were different from the ones below. They were smaller, more like cells, with heavy doors that locked from the outside. Many still had leather restraints attached to the bed frames. One room in particular caught my attention. Unlike the others, this one had writing covering every inch of the walls. Not graffiti, but handwriting. Thousands upon thousands of words scratched into the plaster, written in what looked like fingernails or something sharp. I stepped closer to read them. They were the same sentence, repeated over and over. "I don't want the treatment, I don't want the treatment, I don't want the treatment, I don't want the treatment." It covered all 4 walls, the ceiling, even parts of the floor. Someone had spent hours, maybe days, carving this message. The thought of their desperation, their fear, made my stomach turn. "Marcus, we should go," Sarah said from the doorway. She looked pale. "This place is getting to me." I was about to agree when we heard the sound again. The dragging metal. But this time it was much closer. It was coming from somewhere on the third floor with us. Jake pointed his camera down the hallway, using its light to illuminate the darkness. "There's nothing there," he said. But his hand was shaking. We stood in silence, listening. The dragging sound came again, and this time we could tell it was coming from the east wing of the third floor. We were in the west wing. Whatever was making that noise was moving slowly in our direction. "We need to check it out," Jake said. "Are you insane?" Sarah hissed. "That's how people die in horror movies." "This isn't a movie," Jake replied. "It's probably just another explorer or maybe a homeless person. We should at least see if someone needs help." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We moved cautiously down the main corridor toward the east wing. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, creating strange shadows that seemed to move independently. The dragging sound continued, steady and rhythmic. As we approached the entrance to the east wing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were marks on the floor. Scratches in the concrete, running parallel, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly down this corridor. The marks were old, the concrete around them stained dark brown with something that might have been rust. Or blood. The sound stopped. We stood at the threshold of the east wing, our lights revealing a corridor that looked somehow darker than the rest of the hospital, as if the shadows there were thicker. None of us moved. We just stared into that darkness, waiting. Then we heard breathing. Not our own. This was different. Heavy, labored breathing coming from somewhere in the east wing. It sounded wrong, wet and ragged, like someone with fluid in their lungs. "Okay, we're leaving," I said. "Right now." We turned to head back toward the stairwell, moving quickly but trying not to run. That's when the screaming started. It came from behind us, from the east wing. Not one voice but multiple voices, all screaming at once. Men, women, different ages, all crying out in agony and terror. The sound was overwhelming, inhuman in its intensity. We ran. We didn't care about the dangers of the unstable floors or the dark corridors. We just ran. Behind us, the screaming continued, and underneath it, I could hear that dragging metal sound, but faster now, as if whatever was making it was pursuing us. We reached the stairwell and practically threw ourselves down the stairs. Sarah fell halfway down the first flight, but Jake and I grabbed her and kept moving. The screaming echoed through the stairwell, seeming to come from above and below us simultaneously. When we burst out of the side door into the cool night air, the screaming cut off instantly. Complete silence. We ran to Jake's car and didn't stop until we were back on the main highway, miles away from Riverside. None of us spoke during the drive home. What could we say? What we'd experienced defied explanation. When we finally reviewed Jake's footage, we found something that still gives me nightmares. In one shot, taken just before we heard the first dragging sound, there's a figure visible at the end of the second floor hallway. We hadn't seen it at the time. It's just standing there, partially obscured by shadow. But in the next frame, a split second later, it's gone. The thing is, Jake's camera shoots at 60 frames per second. Nothing human could move that fast. But what really disturbs me is what we found in the audio. Underneath all the ambient noise, there are voices. Dozens of them, speaking in whispers. We enhanced the audio, tried to make out what they were saying. We managed to isolate a few phrases. "Help us. It hurts. Please make it stop. Don't leave us here." I did some research after that night. Riverside Psychiatric Hospital had a dark history that went far beyond what was publicly known. In the 1960s and 70s, the hospital was known for its aggressive treatment methods. Electroshock therapy, hydrotherapy, insulin shock therapy, and even experimental procedures that bordered on torture. But the worst part was what I found about the East Wing. In 1978, there was a fire in that section of the hospital. 23 patients died, most of them locked in their rooms. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but there were rumors that the fire had been started deliberately by a staff member who had finally snapped after years of witnessing the horrible treatments. The bodies were found in their beds, many with their hands clenched in fists so tight that their fingernails had drawn blood from their palms. The autopsies revealed that several had still been alive when the flames reached them, but the doors had been locked. They couldn't escape. They had screamed and clawed at the walls until the smoke and flames took them. The dragging sound we heard? In the old staff reports I found, there were mentions of an orderly named Eugene who worked the night shift. He had a prosthetic leg that scraped against the floor as he made his rounds. Eugene was known for being particularly cruel to the patients. He would drag a metal rod along the cell doors as he walked, a warning that he was coming. The patients lived in terror of that sound. Eugene died in the fire too. He was found in the East Wing, crushed under a collapsed beam. According to the autopsy report, he had been alive for several hours after the collapse, unable to move, unable to call for help, slowly suffocating as smoke filled the corridor. I've been back to that area of Indiana 3 times since that night, but I've never gone near Riverside again. I've driven past the entrance to that overgrown driveway, and each time I feel that same oppressive presence. That feeling of being watched by something that doesn't want to be forgotten. Sarah won't talk about what happened. She deleted all her sketches and notes from that night. Jake, the skeptic who wanted to investigate the sounds, he's different now. He doesn't do urban exploration anymore. He told me once, late at night after too many drinks, that he still hears the screaming sometimes when he's trying to fall asleep. As for me, I still document abandoned buildings. It's my passion, my career. But I'm more careful now. I pay attention to my instincts, because I learned something at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital. Some places are abandoned for a reason. Some buildings hold on to their past, onto the pain and suffering that occurred within their walls. And sometimes the people who suffered there are still waiting, still hoping for someone to hear them, still hoping for someone to make it stop. Story 2, the quarantine wing of St. Mary's Hospital. This story comes from a woman named Jennifer, a nurse who had an experience that made her question everything she thought she knew about death and what comes after. I've been a registered nurse for 15 years. I've worked in emergency rooms, intensive care units, and hospice care. I've seen death more times than I can count, held the hands of people as they took their last breaths, comforted grieving families. I thought I understood the nature of mortality, the clinical reality of what happens when a body stops functioning. Then I spent a night in the old St. Mary's Hospital in West Virginia, and everything I believed was shattered. St. Mary's was built in 1924 and operated continuously until 2008, when it was finally shut down due to financial difficulties. The building sat empty for 8 years before a development company purchased it with plans to convert it into luxury apartments. I was hired as part of a consulting team to assess the building for hazardous materials, asbestos, lead paint, that sort of thing. The job was supposed to take 3 days. We were a team of 6. Myself, 2 environmental specialists, a structural engineer, a project manager, and a security guard. We'd work during the day documenting everything, taking samples, and creating a comprehensive report. I'd volunteered for this job specifically because of the hospital connection. I was curious to see how the building had been laid out, to walk through the spaces where so many people had been treated over the decades. There's something almost sacred about hospitals, even abandoned ones. They're places where life begins and ends, where miracles and tragedies occur daily. The first 2 days were uneventful. St. Mary's was large but not massive, about 200 beds at its peak. Most of the equipment had been removed when it closed, but there were still plenty of remnants. Empty supply closets, patient rooms with old curtain rails, nurse stations with faded logbooks left behind. On the 3rd day, we were supposed to document the 4th floor, which had been the quarantine and infectious disease ward. This section had been built during a tuberculosis outbreak in the 1930s and had been updated over the years to handle various contagious diseases. It was isolated from the rest of the hospital, with its own ventilation system and sealed access points. We reached the 4th floor around 2 in the afternoon. The stairwell door was marked with old biohazard warnings, faded but still visible. The environmental specialists, Tom and Rachel, went in first with their detection equipment. The rest of us followed. The quarantine wing felt different immediately. The other floors had been relatively open, with natural light coming through windows. But this floor was designed to be sealed. The windows were smaller, covered with thick wire mesh. The corridors were narrower. Everything was painted in institutional green and white, now faded and stained. There were 20 isolation rooms, 10 on each side of the main corridor. Each room had a small window in the door for observation and a sealed pass-through chamber for delivering food and medication. These were rooms where patients had spent weeks or months, cut off from human contact, fighting diseases that could spread with a single cough. Rachel found elevated levels of various substances, nothing immediately dangerous but enough to warrant careful documentation. We split up to work more efficiently. Tom and Rachel continued their environmental assessment. David, the structural engineer, examined the integrity of the walls and ceiling. Our project manager, Susan, was photographing everything. The security guard, an older man named Bill, stationed himself at the entrance to the wing. I went room to room, documenting the medical infrastructure that remained. In some rooms, I found old oxygen ports in the walls, outdated nurse call buttons, even a few rusted four-poles that had been left behind. Room 417 stood out. Unlike the others, this room had additional modifications. The door was reinforced, the window in the door had been covered with metal sheeting, and there were what looked like extra locks that had been installed after the original construction. Someone had wanted to make sure that whatever was in this room stayed inside. I tried the door and found it unlocked. It swung open with a long, protesting creak. The room beyond was dark despite the afternoon sun outside. The window had been painted over with thick black paint, and the weak light from the corridor barely penetrated the space. I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside. The room was empty except for a hospital bed frame bolted to the floor in the center of the room. But what covered the walls made me stop breathing. Writing. So much writing. Every surface was covered with handwritten text in what looked like pencil or charcoal. Not words exactly, but numbers. Thousands and thousands of numbers, written in small, precise handwriting. I stepped closer to read them. They weren't random. They were dates and times, written in a specific format. MM/DD/YHH. MM. They covered the walls from floor to ceiling, continuing across the ceiling itself. Whoever had written these had documented dates and times going back decades. The earliest date I could find was March 15, 1957, 3:47. The latest was November 8, 2007, 11:23, just a few months before the hospital closed. Beneath many of the dates were names. First and last names, written in the same careful hand. I recognized some of them. Sarah Mitchell, James Rodriguez, Emma Chin. These were common enough names, but something about seeing them written on these walls disturbed me deeply. Jennifer, you should see this. Tom's voice crackled through the radio on my belt. I left room 417 and found Tom and Rachel in room 409, near the end of the corridor. Tom was holding his electromagnetic field detector, and the readings were spiking erratically. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "There's no power in this building. The electricity was shut off years ago. But I'm getting massive EMF readings in this room and several others on this floor. Could it be from power lines outside?" I asked. Rachel shook her head. "We're 4 stories up and there are no power lines close enough to cause this. Besides, the readings are localized to specific rooms. 409, 412, 417, 420, and 423. The pattern doesn't match any electrical source I can think of." Room 417. The room with all the dates and names. I was about to mention what I'd found when Susan's voice came through the radio, high and panicked. "Someone needs to come to 423 right now. Please. There's something wrong here." We ran. Susan was standing in the doorway of room 423, her camera hanging forgotten at her side. She was pale and shaking. "Look at the floor," she whispered. I looked. The floor of room 423 was concrete like all the others. But there were stains. Dark stains that formed shapes across nearly the entire surface. It took me a moment to recognize what I was seeing. They were human-shaped. Dozens of overlapping silhouettes, as if bodies had lain on this floor and left permanent shadows. "It's just water damage," Rachel said, but her voice was uncertain. "Mold, rust from old pipes." I stepped into the room, careful not to disturb anything. The shapes were too precise to be random stains. Each one clearly showed a head, torso, arms, and legs. Some were adult-sized. Some were smaller. Children. On the wall above the bed, someone had painted a single word in red: "Forgive." "I want to leave," Susan said. "I don't care about the rest of the assessment. I want to leave right now." David suggested we take a break, clear our heads. We walked back toward the stairwell where Bill was waiting. But when we reached the door, we found it locked. Not just closed. Locked from the outside. Bill immediately tried his key. It wouldn't turn. He tried the radio to call our support team waiting in the parking lot. Static. Just static. "Cell phones," David said. We all pulled out our phones. No signal. Not even one bar. We tried the emergency exit at the other end of the quarantine wing. Also locked. We were trapped. "Okay, let's not panic," David said, though his voice betrayed his own fear. "Buildings don't just lock themselves. There has to be an explanation. Maybe the locks are automated, connected to some backup power system we don't know about. Then why aren't our radios or phones working?" Susan demanded. We had no answer. For the next hour, we tried everything. We attempted to force the doors. We looked for alternative exits. We checked every window, but they were sealed and reinforced with wire mesh that wouldn't budge. We called out, hoping our support team might hear us, but there was no response. As daylight faded and evening approached, the atmosphere on the quarantine wing changed. The temperature dropped noticeably. Our breath began to fog in the air. And then we started hearing the sounds. At first it was faint, a coughing sound coming from one of the rooms. Then another cough from a different room. Then more overlapping. Soon, it sounded like dozens of people throughout the wing were coughing, struggling to breathe. "It's just the building," Tom said. "Old pipes, air pressure changes." But even he didn't sound convinced. The coughing continued for nearly 20 minutes, then slowly faded. In the silence that followed, we heard something worse. Crying. A woman sobbing desperately, the sound coming from somewhere in the middle of the corridor. I recognized that sound. I'd heard it too many times in my nursing career. It was the sound of someone who had just received terrible news. Someone whose world had just ended. "Room 412, Rachel whispered. "It's coming from 412. We approached the room slowly. The door was closed, but through the observation window we could see movement inside. Shadow shapes shifting in the darkness. As we got closer, the sobbing grew louder, more intense. Susan reached the door first. She looked through the window and screamed. We rushed to her side. Through the window we could see figures in the room. Translucent, barely visible, but undeniably there. A woman sat on the edge of the bed, her face in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. Around her, other figures stood or sat, all of them faded and ghostly. As we watched, one of the figures turned toward the door. Toward us. It was a man middle-aged, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He stared directly at us and his mouth moved. He was saying something, but we couldn't hear the words through the door. Then, suddenly all the figures in the room turned to look at us. All of them, men and women, adults and children, all staring with those hollow, desperate eyes. The door began to rattle in its frame. We ran. We didn't discuss it or debate it. We just ran to the other end of the corridor and huddled together near the emergency exit, as far from room 412 as we could get. For the next several hours, things escalated. Doors throughout the wing would slam open and closed. We'd hear footsteps running up and down the corridor, but when we looked, there was nothing there. The coughing would start and stop at random intervals. And worst of all, we'd occasionally see figures moving through the wing, passing through walls and doors as if they weren't there. Around midnight, I noticed something. The dates and times in room 417. I remembered that the latest date had been November 8, 2007, 11:23, just months before the hospital closed. I checked my phone. November 8th was today's date. And it was currently 11:17. 6 minutes. "We need to get to room 417, I said. "Right now." I explained what I'd found, the pattern of dates and times, the names written beneath them. Something significant had happened on specific dates and times over decades. And in 6 minutes, if the pattern held, something was going to happen again. We made our way to room 417. The door was open just as I'd left it. The walls covered with their dates and times seemed to glow faintly in our flashlight beams. We stood in the center of the room, waiting, not knowing what to expect. At 11:23 exactly, every light in the quarantine wing came on. All of them, simultaneously, blazing with fluorescent intensity despite the building having no power. The sudden illumination was blinding after hours of darkness. And we saw them. All of them. The wing was filled with people. Patients in hospital gowns, nurses in old-fashioned uniforms, doctors in white coats. They filled every room, stood in the corridor, some of them walking through walls or each other as if on different planes of existence. They were all looking at room 417. At us. Then one figure separated from the others and walked toward us. It was an elderly man, thin and pale, wearing a patient gown. As he got closer, I realized I could see through him to the wall behind. He stopped in the doorway of room 417. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was faint, like it was coming from very far away. "I'm so sorry, but we can't leave. We died here alone and afraid. We died thinking no one cared, that we've been forgotten. We can't move on until someone remembers. Until someone acknowledges what happened to us." I found my voice. "What happened here? We were quarantined," the old man said. "Isolated. Some of us had diseases, yes. But others were just inconvenient. Mentally ill. Elderly with no family. People society wanted to forget. They put us here and sometimes they forgot about us. Not for days or weeks. Some of us died alone in these rooms because no one checked on us. No one cared enough to remember we existed." He gestured to the walls of room 417. "I was a patient here. When I realized what was happening, I started keeping track. Every death I knew about, every person who died alone in this wing. I wrote down their names, the dates, the times, so someone would know, so they wouldn't be completely forgotten. How long? I asked. 50 years, he said. I was admitted in 1957. I died in 2007, just before the hospital closed. This was my room. This was my prison. For 50 years, I watched people come here and disappear. And I wrote it all down. The other figures in the wing began to move closer. They filled the corridor outside room 417, pressed against the doorway, all of them looking at us with those hollow, desperate eyes. Please, the old man said. Please remember us. Tell someone we were here. That we mattered. That we were human beings who deserved to be remembered. I was crying. I didn't even realize it until I felt the tears on my face. I promise, I said. I swear to you I'll make sure people know. I'll document every name on these walls. You won't be forgotten. The old man smiled. It was a sad smile, but genuine. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you. The lights went out. All at once, plunging us back into darkness. When we turned on our flashlights, we were alone. The wing was empty, silent, and the emergency exit door stood open. We left the quarantine wing and found our support team in the parking lot, frantic with worry. They told us the doors had locked somehow, that they'd been trying to get in for hours but something had been blocking them. When we checked the time, we found that only 40 minutes had passed since we'd entered the wing, though it had felt like an entire night. I kept my promise. I went back to that wing with proper equipment and photographed every date, every time, every name on the walls of room 417. There were 847 names total, spanning from March 15, 1957, to November 8, 2007. I researched as many as I could. I found death certificates, old hospital records, newspaper obituaries. Many of the names matched people who had died at St. Mary's Hospital, most of them in the quarantine wing, many with circumstances matching what the old man had described. Deaths that occurred alone, unwitnessed, sometimes undiscovered for hours or days. I compiled everything into a report that I submitted to the local historical society. A memorial plaque was eventually installed at the site, listing the names from room 417 and acknowledging the forgotten patients of the quarantine wing. The development company abandoned their plans to convert the building. St. Mary's Hospital still stands empty, but it's different now. People who pass by say it feels quieter, more peaceful. The oppressive atmosphere that hung over the building has lifted. I like to think that the patients of the quarantine wing have finally found peace. That knowing someone remembered them, someone acknowledged their existence and suffering, was enough to let them move on. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working a shift at my current hospital, I think about room 417. About the old man who spent 50 years documenting the deaths of forgotten people, making sure that someone, somewhere, would know they had existed. And I make sure to remember every patient I treat. To acknowledge them not as room numbers or diagnoses, but as human beings with names and stories and lives that matter. Because I learned something in the quarantine wing of St. Mary's Hospital. Being forgotten is a fate worse than death. And sometimes the dead will do anything, endure any torment, just to be remembered. Just to know that someone cared. Story 3. The Children's Ward at Mercy General Hospital. This final story is perhaps the most disturbing of the three. It comes from a man named Robert, a paranormal investigator who has spent years documenting unexplained phenomena. Even with all his experience, what happened at Mercy General Hospital pushed him to his limits. I've been investigating paranormal activity for 23 years. I've been to hundreds of allegedly haunted locations across the United States. I've used every type of equipment available, from EMF detectors to thermal cameras to spirit boxes. I've witnessed phenomena that I can't explain through conventional science. But I've also debunked dozens of hauntings, found rational explanations for things that seem supernatural. I'm a skeptic by nature, but an open-minded one. I need evidence. I need consistency. I need something more than feelings and shadows to believe in the paranormal. Mercy General Hospital in Oregon gave me that evidence. It gave me more than I wanted, more than I could handle. Mercy General was built in 1931 and operated until 2015, when it was replaced by a newer facility across town. The old hospital was massive, covering an entire city block with 6 floors and 2 basement levels. For 84 years, it had served the community, treating hundreds of thousands of patients. But Mercy General had a dark history. In 1962, there was an outbreak of polio in the region. The children's ward, located on the 5th floor, was overwhelmed with young patients. 47 children died during that outbreak, most of them between the ages of 4 and 12. The hospital did everything it could, but medical science at the time was limited. In 1978, there was a different kind of tragedy. A nurse named Catherine Wells, who had worked in the children's ward for over 20 years, suffered a complete mental breakdown. She walked into the medication room, filled a syringe with a lethal dose of morphine, and began going room to room, injecting the children in her care. She killed 6 children before another nurse discovered what was happening and stopped her. Catherine was subdued and taken into custody. She never spoke another word. She died in a psychiatric facility 3 years later, still silent, never explaining why she had done what she did. The children's ward continued to operate after that, but the staff reported problems. Equipment would malfunction. Call buttons would activate in empty rooms. Staff would hear children crying or laughing when no children were present. Some nurses refused to work the night shift on the 5th floor, claiming they felt watched, threatened. In 1993, the children's ward was relocated to the 3rd floor. The 5th floor was converted to storage and administrative use. But the reports didn't stop. Security guards and cleaning staff continued to report strange occurrences on the 5th floor. Eventually, that entire floor was simply closed off and left unused. When Mercy General shut down in 2015, I saw an opportunity. I contacted the property management company and requested permission to conduct a thorough investigation of the 5th floor. It took months of negotiations and liability waivers, but eventually they agreed. I assembled a team of 5 experienced investigators. We planned a 3-night investigation, using a systematic approach to document everything we experienced. We brought state-of-the-art equipment: infrared cameras, full-spectrum cameras, digital audio recorders, EMF detectors, thermal imaging devices, and motion sensors. We arrived on a Friday evening in October. The hospital had been empty for over a year, and it looked it. The exterior was weathered, windows darkened, the landscaping overgrown. Inside was worse. The power was still connected but minimal, just enough light to navigate safely. The building felt hollow, dead. We took an elevator to the 5th floor. The doors opened onto a dark corridor that stretched in both directions. The children's ward had occupied the entire east wing of the 5th floor. The west wing had been administrative offices. We focused our investigation on the east wing. The first thing that struck me was how much had been left behind. Unlike most hospital closures, where equipment and furniture are removed, Mercy General's children's ward still contained much of its original contents. Pediatric beds, some still made up with faded linens. Toys scattered across common rooms. Educational posters on the walls showing cartoon animals and alphabet letters. It was like everyone had just walked away one day and never come back. We set up our base of operations in the nurses' station at the center of the ward. From there, we deployed equipment throughout the east wing. Cameras in every room, audio recorders in strategic locations, motion sensors in the corridors. The first night was quiet. We documented the layout, took baseline readings, and established our protocols. We experienced nothing unusual. By 4 in the morning, I was starting to think this would be another case where the reported activity didn't hold up under investigation. The second night was different. We arrived around 7 in the evening, reviewed the previous night's recordings, which showed nothing, and began our investigation. Around 9:30, one of my team members, a woman named Linda, was conducting an EVP session in room 512. This is a technique where you ask questions aloud and record the audio, hoping to capture responses that weren't audible in real time. Linda was sitting alone in the room with her recorder running. We could hear her through the monitor system we'd set up. "Is anyone here with me?" she asked. "Can you tell me your name?" Silence. "If you're here, can you give me a sign?" That's when we heard it through the monitor. A child's voice, clear and distinct. "I'm scared." Linda heard it too. We could see her freeze on the infrared camera. "It's okay to be scared," she said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you. Can you tell me why you're scared?" Another voice, different from the first. "She's coming." "Who's coming?" Linda asked. "The nurse. The bad nurse." I felt the temperature drop in our base station. We were monitoring thermal readings throughout the ward, and suddenly every sensor was showing a decrease of 15 to 20 degrees. In seconds. "Linda, get out of that room," I said into the radio. But before she could respond, we heard footsteps through the audio monitors. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving down the corridor. But here's the thing, our motion sensors weren't triggering. Whatever was making those footsteps wasn't registering as physical movement. Linda came rushing back to the nurse's station, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" The voices were so clear. And then the footsteps. I felt her walk past me. I felt the air move. But I couldn't see anything. We reviewed the audio. The child's voices were there, exactly as we'd heard them. But underneath, barely audible, there was something else. A woman's voice humming. The melody was familiar, a lullaby. Hush, little baby. For the next hour, activity escalated. Call buttons began activating throughout the ward, the old-fashioned ones that would light up at the nurse's station. They'd been disconnected from power for years, but they were lighting up in sequence, room by room, as if someone was going down the hallway pressing each one. We heard children's voices throughout the ward. Laughing, playing, crying. Sometimes words, sometimes just sounds. Our audio recorders were capturing everything. Then around 11 o'clock we heard the screaming. It came from room 518 at the far end of the corridor. A child's scream, high and terrified, cutting through the darkness. Then another scream from room 520. Then room 522. One by one moving down the hallway, children screaming in terror. We need to document this, I said, grabbing a camera. Against the protests of my team, I headed down the corridor toward the screaming. The screams were so loud, so real that I couldn't believe they were paranormal. They sounded like children in immediate danger. Every instinct I had as a human being told me to help them. I reached room 518 and pushed open the door. The room was empty but freezing cold. My breath fogged in thick clouds. The screaming continued, seeming to come from the walls themselves. On the bed, something began to appear. A child-sized impression in the mattress, as if invisible weight was pressing down on it. Then another impression beside it, and another. The mattress compressed in 5 different places, showing the outlines of small bodies. I raised my thermal camera. Through the viewfinder, I could see them. 5 children, their thermal signatures glowing against the cold room. They were lying on the bed, writhing, their mouths open in silent screams. No, not silent. The screams I was hearing were theirs. Then I saw something else. A figure standing at the foot of the bed. An adult-sized thermal signature, feminine in shape. She was holding something in her hand. As I watched, she reached toward one of the children. The child's screaming intensified, then stopped abruptly. The thermal signature faded. Disappeared. The woman moved to the next child. I stumbled backward out of the room, my heart pounding. Through the thermal camera, I could still see her. She was in the corridor now, moving toward the next room. Room 520. Where the screaming had moved to. Everyone back to base, I radioed. No, this is not a drill. We regrouped at the nurse's station. I showed them the thermal footage. We watched in horror as the woman's figure moved methodically from room to room, and in each room, small thermal signatures appeared and then disappeared. It's a loop, Linda said. We're seeing the past. The night Catherine Wells killed those children. It's playing out again. But why? Another team member asked. Why would this event repeat? We didn't have an answer. We just watched as the figure completed its terrible circuit of the ward and then faded away. The screaming stopped. The temperature began to normalize. But we weren't done. Around 1 in the morning we heard singing. Children's voices, dozens of them, singing Ring Around the Rosie. The sound was coming from the common room at the center of the ward, a large space that had once been used for play and activities. We approached cautiously, cameras rolling. Through the doorway we could see movement. The darkness seemed to shift and flow like water. We turned on our flashlights. The room was full of children. Not thermal signatures this time. Not translucent ghosts. Solid, visible children in hospital gowns and pajamas. Some sitting on the floor, some standing, some in wheelchairs. They were playing, laughing, singing. They looked so real, so alive that for a moment I forgot where I was. Then one of them noticed us. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, with long dark hair. She stopped singing and stared directly at me. Are you doctors? She asked. I didn't know what to say. My team was frozen behind me. We're here to help, I managed. The little girl's expression changed. Her smile faded. You can't help. We tried to get help, but nobody came. The bad nurse came instead. The other children had stopped playing now. They were all looking at us. Their expressions shifted from joy to fear to sadness. We didn't want to die, a boy said. He looked about 10, thin and pale. We were sick, but we were getting better. Then she came and we died anyway. Not all of us, another child interjected. A girl in a wheelchair, older than the others. Some of us died from the sickness. We died slow. We died in pain. We called for our parents, but they couldn't come in. Quarantine. We died alone. The little girl with dark hair stepped closer to us. Do you know what it's like to die alone? To be so sick and scared, and the last thing you see is a ceiling and the last thing you hear is your own crying? I felt tears on my face. I'm sorry, I whispered. I'm so sorry that happened to you. She's still here, the little girl said. The bad nurse. She never left. She keeps trying to help us, but she doesn't understand. She keeps giving us medicine, but we're already dead. She won't accept it. She won't stop. As if summoned by the words, we heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps in the corridor outside the common room. The children's expressions changed to terror. Hide, one of them whispered urgently. She's coming. The children scattered, fading like smoke. In seconds the room was empty. But the footsteps continued, getting closer. A figure appeared in the doorway. She was tall and thin, wearing a nurse's uniform from the 1970s. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken and hollow. She held a tray with a syringe on it. She looked directly at us, but I had the feeling she wasn't seeing us. She was seeing something else. Someone else. Time for your medicine, children, she said. Her voice was wrong, flat and emotionless. This will make you feel better. This will take away the pain. She walked into the room, right past us as if we didn't exist. She moved to the corner where the little girl with dark hair had been standing. She knelt down, reaching out with the syringe towards something we couldn't see. No, please, I don't want it, a child's voice pleaded. The little girl. We could hear her but couldn't see her. It's medicine, the nurse said. Medicine helps. Medicine takes away the pain. Then you can sleep. Sleep forever and never hurt again. We need to stop this, Linda said beside me. But before any of us could move, the nurse stood up and turned to face us. This time she was seeing us. Her hollow eyes focused and recognition flickered across her face. You're not children, she said. You're not patients. You shouldn't be here. This is the children's ward. Only children and medical staff are allowed. She stepped toward us and the temperature plummeted. The air became thick, heavy, hard to breathe. The nurse's form began to change, becoming less solid, more shadow. Her face twisted into something monstrous. Get out, she shrieked, her voice no longer flat but filled with rage. Get out of my ward. Objects in the room began to move. Toys lifted off the floor and flew at us. Small chairs slid across the floor. The windows rattled in their frames. We ran. No documentation, no equipment, just pure flight instinct. We ran down the corridor to the elevator, slapping the button frantically. Behind us, we could hear her coming. Those heavy footsteps moving faster now and that voice screaming, "Get out! Get out! Get out!" The elevator doors opened and we threw ourselves inside. As the doors closed, we caught a glimpse of her in the corridor, reaching toward us, her face a mask of fury. The elevator descended in the longest 30 seconds of my life. When the doors opened on the ground floor, we didn't stop running until we were outside the building, standing in the parking lot under the streetlights. We were all shaking, breathing hard, unable to speak for several minutes. Finally, Linda broke the silence. We left all our equipment up there. I don't care, I said. I'm not going back. But we had to. We'd invested thousands of dollars in that equipment. And part of me, the investigator part, knew that we'd captured something extraordinary. Something that could change the way people understood life and death. We waited until morning, until full daylight. Then, with extreme reluctance, we returned to the 5th floor. In the light of day, it seemed less threatening. Just an abandoned hospital ward, dusty and forgotten. We gathered our equipment quickly, not lingering. As we worked, I noticed something. In the common room, on the floor where the children had been playing, there were marks in the dust. Small handprints and footprints, dozens of them, far too many to have been made by our team. We reviewed the footage later in the safety of my office. Everything was there. The children's voices, the thermal signatures, the figures in the common room. And most disturbing, several minutes of footage from a camera we'd left running in room 518. The footage shows the nurse figure appearing in the room. She approaches the bed, syringe in hand. She pantomimes injecting something, though there's no one visible there. Then she moves to where the next bed would have been during the ward's operational days. She repeats the action. Again and again, working through some remembered routine. But here's what made me shut down the investigation and never return. At one point, the nurse looks directly at the camera, and she smiles. It's not a mad smile or an evil smile. It's a gentle, caring smile. The smile of someone who genuinely believes they're helping. Then she mouths 3 words. We had to enhance the footage to be sure, but there's no doubt what she says. They're at peace. I've spent months trying to understand what we experienced at Mercy General Hospital. I've consulted with psychologists, historians, and other paranormal researchers. The prevailing theory is that we encountered a residual haunting overlaid with intelligent entities. The children who died in the 1962 polio outbreak, And the 6 children killed by Catherine Wells in 1978, they're trapped somehow. Their final moments of fear and pain are imprinted on that space, playing out repeatedly. The children we saw and spoke to in the common room, those were intelligent hauntings, spirits aware of their situation but unable to move on. And Catherine Wells? Her spirit is trapped in a delusion. She's reliving the night she killed those children, but in her mind, she's still trying to help them. She's still trying to ease their suffering the only way her broken mind knew how, by ending their lives. The truly horrifying part is that she might be continuing this cycle. The children die over and over in an endless loop. And Catherine Wells continues to kill them over and over, believing she's helping. I submitted my findings to the property management company, along with a recommendation that the 5th floor be sealed permanently. I don't know if they followed through. I don't want to know. What I experienced at Mercy General Hospital changed me. It proved to me beyond any doubt that consciousness persists after death. But it also showed me that the afterlife isn't necessarily peaceful. Sometimes the dead are trapped by trauma, by delusion, by unfinished business. They exist in a state of perpetual suffering, reliving their worst moments forever. The little girl with dark hair, the one who spoke to me, asked if I knew what it was like to die alone. I didn't answer her then, but I think about that question all the time now. I think about all the people who die alone, scared, in pain. What happens to them? Do they move on, or do they get trapped like the children of Mercy General? I've investigated dozens of locations since that night, but I've never encountered anything like the 5th floor of Mercy General Hospital. And I hope I never do again. Because I learned something that night that I wish I could unlearn. Death doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes, death is just the beginning of an even greater nightmare. A nightmare that never ends. And somewhere in an abandoned hospital in Oregon, children are still playing, still laughing, still singing Ring Around the Rosie. Still waiting for their parents who will never come. Still dying over and over again. Still being helped by a nurse who can't accept what she's done. Forever. #conclusion. These 3 stories share a common thread. Abandoned hospitals are more than just empty buildings. They're repositories of human suffering, pain, and death. For decades, these places witnessed the worst moments of people's lives. They absorbed that trauma, that fear, that desperate hope for healing that often went unfulfilled. The people who experienced these hauntings all reported the same fundamental truth: the dead don't always rest. Sometimes they linger, trapped by the circumstances of their deaths, by unfinished business, by the sheer intensity of what they experienced in their final moments. Marcus still photographs abandoned buildings, but he's more careful now about which ones he enters. Jennifer continues her nursing career, but she makes sure every patient she treats feels seen and remembered. And Robert? He still investigates paranormal activity, but he's more selective about which cases he takes on. They all carry the weight of what they witnessed. They all know that death is not the end, and that knowledge is both comforting and terrifying. If you ever find yourself near an abandoned hospital, remember these stories. Remember that the walls might hold more than just memories. They might hold the echoes of lives cut short, of suffering unrelieved, of people who died alone and forgotten. And if you hear footsteps in an empty corridor, or see shadows moving in empty rooms, or feel a sudden drop in temperature, maybe it's time to leave. Because some places are meant to remain abandoned. Some doors are meant to stay closed. And some stories are meant to end. But as these 3 people learn, sometimes the story never really ends. Sometimes it just keeps playing over and over, waiting for someone to bear witness. Waiting for someone to remember. Thank you for listening to these haunting true abandoned hospital horror stories. Sleep well, if you can.